The morning sun lazily filtered through the thin white curtains, casting soft streaks of gold across the wooden floor of the living room. David stood at the kitchen island, methodically spreading peanut butter on the kids' toast. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the aroma of toasted bread, creating the very coziness that he valued so much. It was an ordinary Thursday in the suburbs of Chicago, in a house on Oak Street, where every detail from the neatly trimmed lawn to the white picket fence embodied the American dream that he had read about in books as a child. David, a tall man of 42 with light gray hair at the temples, looked like a man who knew his place in the world. His dark blue eyes, slightly squinted from the habit of long hours at the computer, carefully ensured that the toast turned out perfect, an even layer of butter, no lumps. He was a meticulous detailer, a quality that helped him build a career as a manager at a large financial company in the city center. On the second floor, the familiar sounds of the morning were heard. The footsteps of Jessica, his wife, who was probably already finishing styling her hair in front of the bathroom mirror, and the muffled voices of the children 16-year-old Mike and 14-year-old Sarah. Mike, as usual, grumbled that he didn't want to get up, and Sarah, quietly but persistently, reminded him that the bus wouldn't wait. David smiled to himself. This was his life, predictable, stable, like the well-oiled clock that hung over the fireplace in the living room. He glanced at the dial. 7:15. There is enough time to gather everyone and send them to school and catch the train to the office. Jessica walked downstairs, her heels clicking softly on the wooden steps. She looked as flawless as always. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat bun, light makeup emphasized her brown eyes, and her cream sweater and skinny jeans fit as if they had been made especially for her. In her 40s, she retained the same attractiveness that captivated David almost 2 decades ago when they met in law school. Then she was an ambitious student who dreamed of becoming a lawyer, but after Mike was born, she decided to leave her job and devote herself to her family. David never objected. He liked that order awaited him at home and that his children grew up in care. He considered it part of their overall success. "Good morning," Jessica said, walking over to the coffee maker. Her voice was soft, but with a slight hoarseness, as if she was not yet fully awake. "Good morning," David replied, handing her a cup of coffee. "The toast is ready. Is Mike going to whine about wanting cereal again?" "Most likely," she smiled slightly, accepting the cup. "But I already said that the cereal is out. Let him eat what they give him." He nodded, pleased with her determination. Jessica knew how to keep children in line, although lately David had noticed that Mike's teenage rebellion was becoming more and more obvious. Sarah, on the contrary, remained quiet, almost unnoticeable, but in her silence one could feel some kind of hidden strength, like a river that seems calm until it breaks the dam. A few minutes later, the kitchen was filled with noise. Mike was the first to burst in, his black hair sticking out in different directions, and his headphones hanging around his neck, like an indispensable attribute of his rebellious nature. He threw his backpack on a chair and stared at the toast with a dissatisfied expression. "Seriously? This again?" he grumbled, crossing his arms over his chest. "Eat, Mike," David said calmly, without looking up from the morning newspaper, which he managed to take from the porch. "Or you'll stay hungry until lunchtime." Mike snorted, but took the toast anyway, taking a bite looking like he was doing the world a favor. Sarah appeared next, her school uniform a white shirt and a dark skirt looking slightly wrinkled, but neat. She silently sat down at the table, took the toast, and began to eat without raising her eyes. David noticed that her blonde hair, inherited from him, was braided in a loose braid, a clear sign that she was in a hurry. "How are things at school, Sarah?" he asked, trying to break the silence. "Fine," she answered briefly, without going into details. Her voice was quiet, almost colorless, but David knew there was much more behind it than she was willing to let on. Breakfast went on as usual. Jessica reminded the children about the schedule. David checked that everyone had everything they needed, and half an hour later the family minivan was already leaving the garage. David sat behind the wheel, Jessica next to him, and the children sat in the back, each immersed in their own world, Mike in the music, Sarah in the phone. The trip to school took exactly 15 minutes, and during this time David managed to mentally switch to the workday. In the office, reports, meetings, and endless spreadsheets awaited him, but he loved this routine. She gave him a sense of control, confidence that everything was going according to plan. After the children left the school, Jessica turned to him. "Are you going to be late today?" she asked, looking out the window. "I don't think so," David replied, pulling out onto the main road, "unless Brad decides to hold an unscheduled meeting again." "What are you planning?" "We need to stop by the store, then meet Ashley. She called again yesterday." "How is she doing?" David glanced at her briefly. Ashley, Jessica's younger sister, had always been a little chaotic, but he respected her for her straightforwardness. "I don't know," Jessica shrugged. She sounded upset, but didn't really say anything. "I'll find out today." He nodded, not giving it much thought. Ashley and her husband Alex have long lived like cats and dogs, and rumors of divorce have been in the air for a couple of months. David didn't interfere. It wasn't his business. His world was limited to home, work, and family, and he was quite happy with this boundary. The day passed as usual. In the office, David was lost in numbers and negotiations, but by 5 o'clock he was already riding home on a commuter train, looking out the window at the flashing trees and houses. Thoughts were spinning in my head that I needed to upgrade my lawn, mower the grass in the backyard was starting to overgrow. When he entered the house, he was greeted by the smell of fried chicken and the sound of television from the living room. Jessica stood at the stove, and the children, apparently, had already gone to their rooms. "How was the meeting with Ashley?" he asked, taking off his jacket and hanging it on a hook by the door. Jessica paused for a second before answering. "She's fine," she said without turning around. "He's just worried. Alex seems to have completely annoyed her." "No wonder," David chuckled, going to the refrigerator for a bottle of water. "He was always too charismatic or something." "Yeah, I guess." Jessica's voice sounded distracted, and she quickly changed the subject. "Dinner in 20 minutes. Call the children." David went upstairs, knocked on Mike's door, which had loud music coming from behind it, and looked in on Sarah, who was reading something on her tablet. Both came down without much enthusiasm, but the family dinner went smoothly. They ate and exchanged a few phrases about the day. Late in the evening, after the children had gone to bed and Jessica was sitting in the living room reading a book, David went out into the backyard. He loved these quiet moments, the stars above head, rustling leaves, distant noise of cars. This was his corner of the world, his fortress. He lit a cigarette, a rare bad habit he indulged in once a week, and wondered how long he could maintain this idyll. Something about Jessica's tone when she talked about Ashley struck him as odd, but he brushed the thought aside. David turned onto a familiar street where the house of Jessica's parents, Robert and Margaret, stood. It was an old two-story cottage with peeling yellow paint and a wide porch on which two wicker chairs always stood, like sentinels of the past. Friday evening promised to be warm, and the soft light of the sunset painted the surroundings in golden and pink tones, giving the Chicago suburb an almost idyllic appearance. David loved these trips to his mother-in-law and father-in-law. They were a rare occasion to gather the whole family at one table, away from the bustle of the city and work deadlines. He glanced in the rearview mirror. Mike was sitting with his head buried in his phone, and Sarah was looking out the window, thoughtfully fiddling with the end of her braid. Jessica was silent next to him, her fingers nervously tapping the armrest. David noticed this, but assumed she was just tired after a week of work. He himself felt a slight heaviness in his shoulders. The reports in the office were delayed, and Friday evening seemed like a long-awaited respite. The car stopped at the house, and David turned off the engine. The sounds of music could be heard coming from the open windows, something old-fashioned, like Frank Sinatra, Robert's favorite. The kids reluctantly got out of the car. Mike muttered something about a boring evening, and Sarah simply sighed, adjusting her backpack on her shoulder. Jessica was the last to leave, her cream sweater slightly wrinkled from sitting for so long, but she still looked put together. David found himself thinking that even after 18 years of marriage, she still managed to look like she had just stepped out of a magazine. He smiled at the thought, but the smile quickly faded when he noticed her quickly glance at her phone before putting it away in her bag. Margaret answered the door, her gray hair neatly styled and her floral apron revealing that she had spent the day in the kitchen. "Well, finally," she exclaimed, hugging Jessica. "I thought you were stuck in traffic. Come in, Robert is already pouring the wine." "Hi, Mom," Jessica hugged her back, but her voice sounded a little more tense than usual. David chalked it up to fatigue. "Hello, Margaret," he nodded, following the children in. "It smells divine as always." "This is chicken casserole," Margaret said proudly, closing the door, "and apple pie for dessert. Mike, Sarah, don't just stand there. Go to your grandfather." They were met in the living room by Robert, a short but strong man with thick eyebrows and a good-natured smile. He was wearing a plaid shirt, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and he was holding a bottle of red wine in his hands. "David, good to see you," he said, shaking his hand. "How are things at the office?" "Everything is according to plan," David replied, accepting the glass. "What about you? Are you still tinkering with that car in the garage?" "I'm trying," Robert grinned, "but she seems smarter than me." The children greeted their grandfather, and soon everyone gathered in the dining room. The table was set with Margaret's usual meticulousness, a white tablecloth, porcelain plates, and a vase of flowers from the garden in the center. But one place remained empty. David noticed this immediately. "Where is Ashley?" he asked, taking a sip of wine. "It will be soon," Margaret answered, putting the casserole on the table. "I called half an hour ago and said that I was delayed. Alex, however, won't come. Something about work." "Again," Robert muttered, shaking his head. "This guy is always busy." David nodded, not paying any attention to it. Alex, Ashley's husband, was indeed often absent from work. His career as a lawyer required time and energy. But lately David has heard from Jessica that things aren't going well between him and Ashley. 15 minutes later, the front door slammed and Ashley walked into the dining room. She looked different from her usual self. Her bright red hair was pulled back into a messy ponytail, there were dark circles under her eyes, and her black cardigan hung on her like it was on a hanger. "Hi, everyone," she said, throwing her bag on the sofa. Her voice was hoarse, as if she had been silent for a long time before. "Ashley, darling," Margaret jumped up, hugging her daughter. "You're completely frozen. Sit down quickly." "Yes, okay, Mom," Ashley smiled faintly, but her gaze slid to Jessica and froze for a second. David noticed this, but did not have time to say anything. Margaret was already seating her at the table. Dinner began with the usual buzz of conversation. Robert was talking about his car, Mike was complaining about school tests, and Sarah was silent, picking at her food with a fork. Jessica seemed distracted. She answered at random and reached for wine more often than usual. David watched her out of the corner of his eye, but his attention quickly turned to Ashley. She sat opposite, almost not touching her food, her fingers nervously fiddling with her napkin. "Ashley, are you okay?" he asked when the conversation died down for a moment. She raised her eyes, and something strange flashed in them, a mixture of fatigue and determination. "Not really," she answered quietly. Everyone fell silent, even Mike looked up from the phone. Ashley took a deep breath and blurted out, "I'm divorcing Alex." Silence hung in the air, thick and heavy, as before a thunderstorm. Margaret dropped the spoon, Robert froze with the glass in his hand, and Jessica turned so pale that her face became almost the same color as the tablecloth. David felt something clench inside him, but he remained calm. "What?" Margaret gasped. "Ashley, are you serious?" "Yes, Mom." Ashley nodded. Her voice was shaking, but she held on. "I submitted the documents this week. He and I. This has been a long time coming." Robert coughed, trying to control himself. "Well, daughter, you could have told us earlier. What's happened?" "It all happened, Dad." Ashley smiled bitterly. "He is not who he says he is. I'm tired of pretending that everything is fine with us." David looked at Jessica. She sat motionless, her fingers clenching the stem of her glass. He wanted to ask what she thought, but something in her gaze stopped him. He turned to Ashley instead. "Are you sure this is the right decision?" he asked softly. "Absolutely," she replied, looking him straight in the eyes. "I can't live with him anymore." The tension at the table became almost palpable. Margaret began to fuss, offering everyone refills, as if food could drown out the awkwardness. Robert muttered something about men and their egos, and the children looked at each other, not knowing how to react. But David couldn't take his eyes off Jessica and Ashley. It was as if there was an invisible thread stretching between them tight, ready to burst. Ashley looked at her sister with barely concealed resentment, and Jessica avoided her gaze, staring at her plate. "Jess, won't you say anything?" Ashley suddenly asked, her voice becoming sharper. Jessica shuddered and looked up. I, I'm sorry, Ashley," she said, but the words sounded empty, like a rehearsed phrase. "If it's better for you, then I'm happy for you." "Are you glad?" Ashley narrowed her eyes. "Is it true?" "Of course," Jessica swallowed, her smile strained. "You know, I'm always for you." David frowned. Something was wrong. He knew Jessica too well, her voice, her gestures. She was lying, or at least hiding something. But before he could intervene, Margaret clapped her hands. "Okay, enough about the sad things," she said too loudly. "Let's eat pie. Ashley, tell me, how are your paintings?" The conversation returned to normal with difficulty, but the atmosphere remained tense. David ate the pie and listened to Robert chatter about the weather, but his thoughts were far away. He looked at Ashley, who was picking at the dessert with a fork, and at Jessica, who kept glancing briefly at the phone lying next to her. Something was happening, something he didn't understand. The clock on the dashboard read 4:47 p.m., an unusually early time for his return. Everything went well in the office today. Brad, his boss, canceled an unscheduled meeting due to an urgent trip, and David, for the first time in a week, was able to escape the tenacious clutches of worksheets and endless calls. He felt a slight relief, almost joy, imagining how he would surprise Jessica with his appearance. Maybe they'll even have time to grab some coffee in the backyard before the kids get home from school. This thought warmed him as the car rolled gently through the quiet streets of the Chicago suburbs, where every house, every flower bed seemed to be part of a perfect puzzle that he had been putting together for years. The radio was playing a soft jazz tune, and he found himself humming the tune as his fingers tapped the steering wheel. It was one of those rare moments when he felt not just like a husband, father, or manager, but just a person living his life. He was already looking forward to entering the house, throwing his briefcase at the door, and seeing Jessica's surprised face. Maybe she'll be in the kitchen preparing something for dinner, or in the living room reading a book, her favorite thing to do during those quiet afternoons. The car stopped at the white picket fence that surrounded their property. David turned off the engine and stepped out, breathing in the cool air. The house looked as it always did, neat, with the shutters closed and pots of geraniums on the porch. But something was wrong. He noticed it right away. Jessica's car was in the garage, although she had mentioned in the morning that she was going to the store. David shrugged, deciding that she must have changed her mind. He took the briefcase from the back seat and headed towards the door, walking along the stone path. The key turned in the lock with a soft click, and David stepped inside. The house was quiet, no sound of the TV, no children's steps, no usual rustling in the kitchen. He placed his briefcase on the coat rack and took off his jacket, hanging it on the hook. "Jess," he called, but there was no answer. David frowned, listening. The silence seemed strange, almost unnatural for this time of day. He walked through the living room, glancing at the sofa where her book usually lay, but it was empty. The kitchen was also lifeless, no dirty dishes in the sink, no smell of cooking. She must be upstairs, he thought as he climbed the stairs. The steps creaked under his weight, and David tried to walk more quietly, without knowing why. It was just as quiet on the second floor, but a muffled sound came from the bedroom, Jessica's voice, low and intense. The door was ajar, just a couple of inches, and he froze, not daring to enter. Something in her tone stopped him. It was not the voice she used to talk to the children or to him. It was too soft, almost intimate, with a slight trembling that David had not heard for a long time. "I told you not now," he heard her say, and his eyebrows went up. She was clearly on the phone because there was no answer. David stepped closer, pressing himself against the wall to remain unnoticed. His heart started beating faster, although he didn't yet understand why. "No, he'll be back soon," Jessica continued, her voice becoming a little harsher. "You can't just... No, listen to me." David held his breath. He didn't know who she was talking to, but his instinct told him not to interfere. He slowly moved towards the crack in the door, trying to see at least something. Jessica stood with her back to him, her dark hair down and her phone pressed to her ear. She walked nervously from corner to corner, her bare feet walking silently on the carpet. She was wearing the same clothes as in the morning, a cream sweater and jeans, but something in her posture, in the way she clenched her free hand into a fist, made David wary. "You promised that this would be our secret," she suddenly said, and her voice trembled, as if she was holding back tears. "I can't do this anymore, Alex. It's too dangerous. We have children." David froze, feeling the blood drain from his face. Alex. The name hit him like a hammer on glass, breaking the familiar world into fragments. David stood motionless, his mind trying to comprehend what he had heard, but Jessica's words echoed in his head. "You promised it would be our secret." What did this mean? What's the secret? And why did she speak to Alex in such a tone that he had not heard from her even in their most intimate moments? "I don't know how long I can hide this," she continued, her voice becoming quieter, almost a whisper. "Ashley already suspects something. I can see it in her. And David, he shouldn't know anything, do you hear? Never." His name, pronounced with such anxiety, cut on the nerves. Thoughts swirled in a chaotic whirlwind. What is she hiding? How long has this been going on? "Okay," Jessica said after a long pause, "but promise me you'll be more careful. I don't want everything to collapse because of our stupidity." She fell silent, apparently listening to the answer, and then quietly added, "Me too. Bye." David heard her put the phone on the nightstand and quickly stepped back, trying not to make a sound. His heart was beating so loudly that he was afraid she would hear. He climbed down, clinging to the railing so as not to lose his balance. My head felt empty and noisy at the same time, as if someone had turned the radio on at full volume, but all the stations were tuned to white noise. He walked into the living room, sat down on the sofa, and stared into space. My breathing slowly evened out, but my mind refused to accept reality. Jessica and Alex. Secret. The words were spinning in my head like a broken record, and each repetition drove them deeper. He remembered dinner at Robert and Margaret's, the tension between Jessica and Ashley, her absent-mindedness, her quick glances at her phone. Everything that he had attributed to fatigue or family quarrels now took shape in a new, frightening picture. A few minutes later, footsteps were heard from above. Jessica walked downstairs, her face calm, almost serene. She entered the living room and froze when she saw him. "David." Her voice trembled, but she quickly pulled herself together. "Are you home already?" "Yes," he answered, trying to speak evenly. "The meeting was canceled. I decided to return early." "Oh," she smiled faintly, approaching him. "This is unexpected. Would you like some coffee?" "No," he shook his head, looking into her eyes. "I'll just sit for a while." "Tired?" She nodded, but her gaze lingered on him a little longer than necessary. The next morning began with the usual ritual: coffee, toast, the noise of children getting ready for school. But for David, it was different. He stood at the kitchen island, spreading peanut butter on bread, but his movements were mechanical, lacking the meticulous precision that had always distinguished him. He looked at Jessica, who stood at the stove, stirring oatmeal for Sarah, and could not understand how this woman, his wife, the mother of his children, could do such a thing. "You're kind of quiet today," Jessica said without turning around. Her voice was smooth, almost carefree, but David detected a slight tension in it, as if she was testing him. "Probably pressure," he replied, putting a plate of toast on the table. It was a lie, but it sounded natural. He spent years honing his ability to hide his thoughts, a skill useful in the office, and now, it seems, at home. Jessica nodded without further questioning and continued cooking. Mike came downstairs, headphones around his neck as always, and threw his backpack on a chair, looking like the world owed him something. Sarah appeared next, her blonde hair braided into a neat braid, a rare sign that she was taking her time today. Breakfast passed in silence, interrupted only by occasional remarks from Jessica about the schedule. David ate, but couldn't taste it. His gaze kept returning to his wife, to her hands, which so calmly held the spoon, to her face, which seemed so familiar and at the same time alien. When the kids left for school and Jessica started clearing the table, David made a decision. He could no longer live in this fog of ignorance. "I'll go to the office," he said, getting up from the table. "I'll probably be late today." "Okay," Jessica replied, looking at him briefly. "Call me if anything happens." Of course, he nodded, although he knew that he would not call. He left the house, got into his car, and drove not to the office, but to the center of the city, to an inconspicuous building on the corner of Lake Street. There, on the third floor, was the office of Richard Kane, a private detective whom David had known since college. Richard was not the closest of friends, but their paths crossed at law school, where David studied before switching to finance, and Richard went into private investigations after a short career in the police. They had not seen each other for years, but David remembered him as a man who knew how to find answers where others saw only dead ends. Richard's office turned out to be just as he had imagined: small, cramped, with a worn leather sofa and a desk littered with papers. There were blinds on the window, letting in thin strips of light, and the air smelled of old tobacco and coffee. Richard himself, a short, stocky man of about 45 with short graying hair, was sitting at the table, leafing through a magazine. When David entered, he looked up and squinted slightly. "David?" Richard put down the magazine and stood up, holding out his hand. "Damn, how many years? What brought you here?" "Hi, Rich." David shook his hand, trying to smile. "I need your help." "Seriously?" Richard pointed to the chair opposite the table. "Sit down." "What happened? Problems at work?" "No." David sat down, feeling the words get stuck in his throat. "This is personal. Very personal." Richard nodded, his face becoming more serious. He took a notepad and pen out of his desk drawer, preparing to listen. David took a deep breath and began to talk briefly, without unnecessary emotions, as if he were reporting on a quarterly report. He mentioned the overheard conversation, Alex's name, the phrase about the secret. Richard wrote without interrupting, only occasionally grunting or nodding. When David finished, there was silence in the room. "So you think she's having an affair?" Richard asked, leaning back in his chair. "I don't want to think, I want to know," David answered honestly. "But I must know the truth." "Can you help me?" "I can." Richard tapped his pen on the notepad. "Surveillance, photos, recordings, whatever you want." Richard nodded, wrote down a few lines, and named the amount. David agreed without bargaining. Money was the last thing on his mind right now. They agreed on the details. Richard will begin to monitor Jessica from the next day and will record her movements, calls, and meetings. If Alex shows up, he'll be a priority target. David handed over the deposit, shook Richard's hand, and left the office, feeling a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. Returning home for lunch, David began his own observation. He wasn't going to rely solely on the detective. He needed to do something so as not to go crazy from the unknown. Jessica was in the living room, flipping through a magazine while sitting on the couch. Her phone lay nearby, face down, and David noticed her glance at him as he entered. "You're early again," she said, closing the magazine. "Everything is fine?" "Yes," he lied, sitting down in the chair opposite. "I just decided to take a break." "How is your day?" "Usual," she shrugged. "I went to the store and tidied up a little. Nothing interesting." He nodded, but his eyes followed her every move. As she stood up to pour water, he noticed her fingers tremble slightly. When she returned, he asked without looking at her, "Did Ashley call?" "No," she answered too quickly. "And what?" "Just wondering how she was doing after dinner," he said, watching her reaction. "Probably okay." Jessica looked away. "She always copies." David said nothing, but everything was boiling inside him. He began to notice little things that he had not seen before: how she hid her phone, how she avoided long conversations, how her smile became less frequent and tense. He stayed close all day, asking innocent questions, monitoring her answers. In the evening, when the children returned and Jessica went to prepare dinner, he snuck into the bedroom and checked her bag. Nothing suspicious, just a wallet, keys, lipstick. But she did not let go of the phone, and this only fueled his suspicions. At night, lying next to her in bed, David looked at the ceiling, listening to her even breathing. She was sleeping, but he couldn't. His mind was full of questions, and each of them demanded an answer. The crash in the living room seemed to shatter the usual calm of a Saturday morning. Ashley, flushed and nervous, almost shouted at Jessica, who stood in the middle of the room and frantically clenched her fists. Robert and Margaret, the sisters' parents, had just entered the house and looked at them with stunned faces. David, who was a little further away, did not take his eyes off this scene, feeling how everything inside him was shrinking from tension. It seemed that their whole cozy world was splitting into pieces under the pressure of some terrible secret that was about to spill out. "Do you even understand how I feel?" Ashley blurted out, her voice sounding strained. "You are my older sister. I always looked at you as an example. And now I understand how far you are from the image that I came up with for myself." Jessica pursed her lips. She looked both guilty and angry. Mixed emotions flashed in her eyes: fear, irritation, pain. But she stubbornly did not look at David, as if she was afraid to catch his eye. "Ashley, please calm down," Margaret intervened, trying to speak in a peaceful tone. "We can discuss everything calmly." "No, Mom, we can't," Ashley snapped. "I'm tired of pretending that everything is fine. Alex. Alex drove me to despair, and Jessica simply turned a blind eye to everything, although she knew what was happening." At the mention of Alex, Jessica's face darkened even more. David noticed how she mechanically rubbed her left arm, as if there was a sore spot there. Robert, trying to maintain authority, stepped closer to his daughters. "Girls, this is not a market. Let's sit down and talk. We are all family. Screaming will only make the situation worse." But Ashley didn't seem to want to calm down. She looked at David for the first time in all this time and suddenly asked, "David, isn't it strange to you that your wife acts as if she has a cannon in her face? Don't you feel like there's something wrong here?" David's insides went cold. He did not expect a direct question, and even in such a rude form. He wanted to answer that, yes, he felt, and had been for a long time, but he could not reveal everything he knew. He just clenched his teeth, realizing that the moment of truth was just around the corner. "Ashley," he finally exhaled, "let's not discuss this in front of our parents now. If you have something to say, let's sit down and talk." She snorted almost contemptuously. "Shall we talk? Okay, just don't think that I will speak quietly and calmly. I'm tired of pretending." Jessica looked at David helplessly, and he noticed how her lips began to tremble. He felt sorry for her, despite everything, but he could not forget her quiet words, heard in secret. "You promised that this would be our secret, Alex." Until now, they sounded in his head like an alarming melody that could not be turned off. "Let's go to the kitchen," Robert suggested, trying to regain control of the situation. "At least everyone can sit at the table there." However, Ashley shook her head sharply. "No, I have no desire to hypocritically sit and drink tea. I came to say that I hate all these lies. Alex." She paused, and anger flashed in her eyes. "Alex deceived me for many months, and some of you knew everything all this time and were silent. So," this sentence made Jessica tense. It was as if her whole body had shrunk, like an animal pressed against the wall. David saw her eyes flicker to the floor, avoiding Ashley or him. "Ashley, Jessica began, but her sister raised her hand, interrupting her. "Don't you dare say that you have nothing to do with it," she shouted. "Your silence is worse than any betrayal. And guess what? I think there's a lot more going on here than it seems. I saw how you look at the phone, how you grab it at every signal. Only those who are afraid that the truth will come out behave this way." David sighed heavily. If earlier he was still trying to remain calm, now he understood. Ashley was on the verge of laying out all her guesses right now, in front of the whole family. And the worst thing is that these guesses are most likely close to reality. Daughter, that's enough, Margaret said pleadingly. We're all on edge as it is. Let's talk in a calmer environment. Ashley smiled bitterly. Calm environment. When my husband cheated on me and my sister seemed to know, or she swallowed hard, or she was even involved in it herself. It sounded like an explosion. For several moments, there was deafening silence. Even the noise of the cars outside the window seemed to become quieter. Robert turned pale, Margaret put her hand to her lips, and Jessica seemed to stop breathing. David felt a trembling in his knees. Even he, although he was ready for something like this, did not expect that everything would happen so abruptly. What are you talking about? Jessica finally whispered. You don't think that I... Why not? Ashley interrupted her, glaring at her sister. You have always been an ideal for me, but ideals don't just collapse. For me to suspect this, I needed to see some things. Or hear. David realized that he was not the only spy in this family. Ashley may have also overheard and noticed oddities more than once, but she, unlike him, did not remain silent. I didn't want to talk about this in front of my parents and David, Ashley continued, but you leave me no choice. I began to suspect a month ago that there was something between you and Alex. It looked strange to say the least. Constant calls, your nervousness, abrupt change of topic when it came to my problems. And you know, Jessica, even your eyes changed when I mentioned his name, as if you were afraid that I would catch some movement on your face. That's a lie, Jessica managed, without looking at her sister. Lie? Ashley laughed bitterly. Have you seen how many messages I have from unfamiliar numbers on Alex's phone? I asked him what these numbers were, and at first he got away with it. But in the end, he admitted that he was communicating with someone about family issues. Family-friendly, Jessica? Whose questions do you think these might be? He and I don't have children and didn't plan to have any. So what are these family ones? Of course, he didn't say your name, but I'm not a fool. Tears welled up in Ashley's eyes, but she continued talking as if she was afraid to stop and lose her courage. When I realized that it could be about you, I began to observe. And then I began to have more and more reasons to think that you. She didn't finish, pursing her lips, but it was clear to everyone what she meant. Jessica sat down abruptly on the sofa, as if her legs could not support her. Margaret looked from one daughter to the other, unable to utter a word. Robert frowned, trying to remain calm, but David could see his fists clenching. He himself wanted to scream, run out of the house, or do anything, just not to hear all this. But he understood that this outbreak was just the tip of the iceberg. Jessica, he said quietly, finally trying to control his own trembling, answer her. Say it straight. Are you in a relationship with Alex? His voice sounded cold, but there was a plea hidden in the depths of his eyes, the hope that all this would turn out to be a terrible mistake. He felt his heart pounding like a hunted animal and waited for an answer that could completely destroy his life. Jessica bit her lip. She didn't look at David, didn't look at Ashley, but seemed to be staring at one spot on the carpet. She seemed to be looking for words that could save her. But there were no necessary words. I have. She began, and her voice broke. I don't know how to explain this. Ashley raised her hand. So you didn't have an affair, or was it? It's not what you think, Jessica whispered, finally raising her eyes, filled with tears. Yes, I talked with Alex. But what? Ashley almost shouted. What? Jessica closed her eyes, as if she was afraid to see condemnation in the eyes of those gathered. I didn't want to ruin your life, she said brokenly. I tried to help him. He came to me and said that everything is bad with you, that you don't listen to him. I just became a vest for him, you know, and at some point Her voice stopped and tears flowed down her cheeks. But it was clear to everyone in this room what she did not dare say out loud. David closed his eyes, feeling the ground disappear from under his feet. Ashley clenched her fists so hard her knuckles turned white. Margaret, unable to bear it, turned away and Robert exhaled loudly, as if trying to contain his anger. So, after all, Ashley began, and her voice broke. I can't. I can't believe it. Jessica frantically wiped her eyes. It was. It was a mistake, she said plaintively. I'm confused. He was so convincing, so unhappy, and I felt lonely lately. David felt anger flare up in his heart. Lonely? Yes, he tried for her, did everything he could to provide for his family. He spent days and nights in the office, trying to ensure that they had a stable income so that the children grew up in prosperity. And now it turns out that this is what created the crack through which treason penetrated. That's it, he said hoarsely, looking at his wife. Lonely? So lonely that you decided to shelter Alex in your heart and bed? The words came out harsher than he intended, but rage clouded his eyes. Jessica shuddered as if he had slapped her in the face. Dad, Mom, do you hear? Ashley said, turning to her parents. My own sister. My husband. They... Margaret covered her face with her hands and cried quietly. Robert raised his eyebrows, but remained silent, apparently realizing that his intervention would not help. Ashley suddenly grabbed her bag from the sofa. I can't stay here. Sorry, Dad, Mom. Sorry, David. But to see her in this house is disgusting to me. With these words, she rushed to the door, almost ran out into the street, not wanting to be near her sister for another second. Margaret and Robert looked at each other. They clearly did not know what to do. David remained standing, staring at Jessica as if he was seeing her for the first time. How? He whispered, feeling a spasm in his throat. How could you? Jessica didn't answer. She seemed to have lost the ability to speak. Robert quietly touched David's shoulder. Should I go get Ashley? Go, David answered without turning around. I'll catch up with you later. When the parents left the house, leaving the couple alone, the silence became scorching, like hot metal. David didn't know what to say. It was filled with pain, rage, and some strange devastation at the same time. Jessica looked directly at him for the first time in a long time, and he saw despair in her eyes. David, she muttered, I didn't want it to turn out like this. But it turned out, he said coldly. How long did it take you? She looked away. Several months, but we only met a couple of times. A couple of times, what? He felt that he could not contain himself. Did you sleep a couple of times? Or did you go to hotels a couple of times? He didn't want to go into dirty details, but inside everything was seething with jealousy and resentment. Jessica swallowed. We didn't have a serious relationship. It just happened, that's all. I tried to stop, but he threatened to tell you and Ashley everything if I stopped answering my calls. David looked at her with a bitter smile. So you were under pressure? Seriously, Jessica, are you saying that Alex forced you? She almost burst into tears again. No, I'm as guilty as he is. But I swear I didn't feel love for him. It was some kind of painful addiction that I could not get rid of. And then, when Ashley decided to divorce him, I realized that everything was out of control. Out of control? David smiled bitterly. Yes, your excuse sounds pathetic. You knew exactly what you were doing. He wanted to add something else, but suddenly he heard the door slam upstairs. Looking out into the corridor, he saw Sarah standing on the stairs with frightened eyes. Mike appeared nearby. Obviously, the children had long since woken up from the screams. They looked at each other, not understanding what was happening, but a feeling of anxiety was already visible on their faces. Dad, Mom, why are you yelling like that? Mike asked quietly, not yet knowing where to put his hands. Ashley's aunt. She screamed. Jessica quickly wiped away her tears and took a step towards the children, as if she wanted to hug them. It's okay, she said, trying to pull herself together. Just a quarrel, family matters. Mike looked at his father incredulously. Family? We are also part of the family. David wanted to say that everything was fine, but he realized that he couldn't lie. He lowered his eyes and muttered, Yes, family. You better go back to your place for now. Then we'll talk. But Dad, Sarah began, but Jessica motioned for her to shut up. The children did not insist. They were too accustomed to obeying their parents, and the sight of their mother crying and trembling clearly frightened them. Going upstairs, Mike still looked back, and David noticed a mixture of resentment and anxiety in his eyes. When the children disappeared upstairs, David turned to Jessica. "We'll talk to them too," he said quietly. "But before I see Ashley and my parents, I need to know every last detail." "Enough lies. Tell me everything about how it happened." Jessica nodded desperately, realizing there was no turning back, and she began to speak, with difficulty squeezing out words that made David's heart clench and his eyes darken. It was a long, painful story of fear, temptation, and feelings that she herself could not fully articulate. And the more she talked, the clearer it became that their marriage could not return to its previous state. News about Jessica and Alex's mistake, of course, was not hidden in a narrow family circle. The world moves fast, especially in a small suburb where everyone knows everyone. Already on Monday, several people from the neighbors approached David with questions as if by chance, but he felt that they were simply eager to collect gossip. Jessica almost never left the house. She somehow shrunk inside herself, trying to lead her usual way of life, but her eyes were empty and tear-stained. David left for work early every day so as not to see her for morning coffee or ordinary small matters. He no longer offered to give the children a ride, leaving it to Jessica. Mike and Sarah felt the tension. A tense silence now reigned at home, and every conversation about the future only caused irritation. Mike, at 16, was used to the idea that his parents were a bastion of stability, but now this stability has collapsed. He spent more time with friends or with headphones in his room, trying to disengage. Sarah, a more subtle nature, began to withdraw. She always tried to somehow pacify her parents or distract them with conversations about school, but she understood that nothing would come of it. One evening, about a week after that ill-fated scandal, David received a call from Richard, a private detective whom he had hired even before Jessica's final confession. Richard said he had the data and that it confirms our worst fears. When David heard the familiar words, a chill ran through his skin. He already knew everything, but part of his mind still hoped that this story was some kind of monstrous misunderstanding. That same evening, without notifying Jessica, he went to Richard's office. Behind the round table, littered with papers and an old coffee thermos, lay a folder. It contained printouts of photographs of Jessica and Alex entering the Rosemary Inn several times. The dates indicated in the photo coincided with the very days when Jessica allegedly went shopping or met with friends. "I didn't know the situation had already come up," Richard said, handing out a stack of paper with notes on phone calls. "Usually clients wait for exactly this evidence so that they can then present it to their partner. But since everything was revealed earlier, I don't know if you need these materials now." David took the photographs, looking at them through a haze of rage. Even with everything that had happened, seeing actual evidence of the wife he once idolized walking into a hotel with her sister's husband was unbearably painful. "Thanks, Rich," he said quietly, putting the photo aside. "I don't know what to do next with this, but thank you." Richard nodded understandingly. "I sympathize, buddy. Nobody deserves this situation. If you need anything else, legal advice or anything else, please contact us." David burned the photographs and printouts later that night. He didn't want the children to see them. He no longer needed any kind of evidence. Jessica admitted it herself, and there was no point in hiding it all anymore. But the anger and pain remained, and now they were only growing. At the same time, Alex himself behaved as if nothing had happened. He avoided appearing with his family, although according to rumors he was going through a tense divorce process with Ashley. She didn't want to see him, and the only time he tried to show up to her with a bouquet of roses, she simply threw the flowers into the street. Ashley moved to a small rented apartment closer to the center, away from memories and from people who knew about her marriage. Jessica tried to contact her sister, but Ashley stopped all her attempts, hung up on her, or did not open the door. The only time they almost crossed paths was in a supermarket parking lot, but Ashley, seeing Jessica's car, abruptly drove away. Her sister's silence caused Jessica almost more pain than her own husband's coldness. After all, she and Ashley were so close in childhood, shared secrets, and helped each other. Now Jessica has lost her family, her sister, and it seems everything that used to make up her familiar world. One evening, when the children had already gone to bed, and Jessica was sitting in the kitchen and looking out the window, David decided to talk to her about the future. He didn't know how to play these games of, let's pretend that everything will work out, and understood that it was impossible to continue living under the same roof in such an environment. "We can't do this anymore," he said, crossing his arms over his chest. "I'm not going to continue to pretend that we have ordinary problems. I know that you tell the children that we are having a quarrel, but in reality it is much more serious." Jessica looked at him, and despair flashed in her eyes. "I know," she said quietly, "and I'm sorry that this happened. But what should I do? Leave? If you want me to leave, I can stay with my parents until things calm down." "And what will this change?" he asked bitterly. "The problem is not where you will sleep. The problem is that you ruined our marriage, and this cannot be fixed by simply moving to another street." She lowered her head. "I know, but maybe in time you can forgive me." David felt a pang of bitterness. "Forgive? Can you imagine what I'm going through right now? You slept with your sister's husband, lied to my face, and now you're talking about forgiveness." Jessica closed her eyes, and a tear rolled down her cheek. "I love you, David. Is it true? I lost my head, stumbled. But our children, our life, you don't want to destroy all this, do you?" He laughed sadly. "You're confusing everything, Jessica. I didn't destroy our marriage. I didn't cheat on you. I didn't betray my family. All these years I worked like hell so that we had a house, so that the children had everything. And I'm not saying that I was perfect all this time, but I would never do something like that." She was silent, and this silence was more eloquent than any words. David understood that even now, after all her confessions, in the depths of her soul, she hoped for a miracle that time would erase the memories and they would begin to live anew. But he felt that he could not forget or forgive. "I'll think about how best to formalize everything legally," he said quietly, getting up from the table. "But most likely we will have to get a divorce. I I don't see any other way." When he went into the living room and then up to his room, he heard Jessica sob. He himself wanted to howl in pain, but he restrained himself because he knew that if he allowed himself to burst into tears now, he would not be able to remain firm in the days to come. And he has to gather it into a fist for his own sake, for the sake of his children, and in order to somehow get through this nightmare. The next morning, David called a taxi and went to the center of Chicago, but not to the office of his company, but to a familiar divorce lawyer, Carla Shoemaker. He had once worked with her on a business project involving finance, and he knew that she was one of the best in the city. Carla was about 35, with short hair and stern eyes. She specialized in family law and was not afraid of the most complex cases. "David," she said as he sat down in her wood-paneled office, "I sympathize. But let's not waste time and get straight to the point. Tell me what happened to you." He had difficulty, but briefly and clearly recounted the situation: Jessica's betrayal with Alex, the desire to get a divorce, teenage children, a house with a mortgage, a joint account, a car. Carla listened attentively, without asking unnecessary questions. When he finished, she pulled the notebook towards her. "The problem is that in your state, infidelity does not automatically provide an advantage in a divorce unless it involves financial abuse. But the presence of a fact of adultery can affect some nuances, for example, the amount of alimony or the distribution of property, if a cause and effect relationship with embezzlement is proven." "I don't need her money," David interrupted, feeling bitterness rising inside. "I need the children to stay with me. I want them to understand that I am not abandoning them." Carla made a note. "Are you ready to seek full guardianship? Keep in mind that with full custody, Jessica will have the right to visit her children, and the court is unlikely to deprive her of parental rights." "I know," David nodded. But I don't want them to live with her permanently. At least not now. Maybe later, when everything calms down. Carla crossed her arms. Fine. But courts in this state generally rule that children stay with their mother unless there is evidence she poses a threat. Jessica is not a drug addict, not an alcoholic, not an abusive mother. The fact of her betrayal will not automatically make the court on your side. David smiled mirthlessly. So, I will have to come to terms with the fact that, having destroyed the marriage, she will also get children. Wonderful. Carla sighed. I understand that you are hurt and offended now, but let's proceed from reality. The court will likely order joint custody, where the children will spend part of their time with you and part with their mother. If both parties do not object, this is quite feasible. What about the house? Asked David, feeling the melancholy scratching inside him. This is our only major asset. The mortgage is almost paid off. The house is divided into halves if there is no marriage contract, the lawyer explained. But you can agree that someone will buy out the other's share. It is also possible that the court will take into account the interests of the children and keep the house for the parent with whom the children will live most of the time. David thought, if the children stay with their mother, Jessica can lay claim to the house. But he had no idea how he would live if he had to leave his home. Okay, he said tiredly. Where to start? From submitting an application, you need to decide whether you will plead irreconcilable differences or treason. In the first case, everything is simpler, but morally more difficult, since guilt is not taken into account. In the second, it is more difficult to prove guilt, but perhaps you will have a slightly better chance when dividing property. I guess I don't want it to look like they just didn't mesh, David said gloomily. I prefer to indicate the reason, even if it complicates the process. Carla nodded. Understood. Then let's start with the preparatory documents. You'll need to collect financial statements, property valuations, bank statements, things like that, and think about how you will discuss this with your wife and children. When he left her office, he felt like a man who had taken a step into the abyss. He knew there was no turning back, but the thought of him starting formal divorce proceedings, hitting the inner wall of his soul with a hammer, still seemed alien and creepy. Returning home, David caught himself thinking that he didn't want to go inside at all. Oak Street, still bathed in sunlight, seemed like a set for someone else's life. The neighbors' houses stood in their usual idle, neat lawns, small flags on mailboxes, a spirit of calm was everywhere. But outside the front door of his own home, David felt only emptiness and pain. Walking inside, he saw Jessica sitting on the sofa, holding a family photo album in her hands. She slowly flipped through the pages, which captured moments from their seemingly happy past. David recognized photos from a wedding anniversary, Christmas a few years ago, summer picnics. Are you home already? She asked quietly, without taking her eyes off the page, where she and David were smiling together against the backdrop of the ocean. Somehow early. I don't want to work from the office right now, he answered dryly. Yes, and the boss is away anyway. She didn't ask where he was. Apparently, she guessed that it was about a meeting with a lawyer or something similar. They were silent for several seconds, only the rustling of pages being turned could be heard. Remember when we went to California when Sarah was 6 and Mike was 8? She suddenly asked. You almost drowned surfing then, and I screamed from the shore like crazy. David sighed quietly. Of course he remembers. It was one of the most vivid memories family, sea, sun, children's laughter. Then it seemed to him that happiness would never end. Yes, he answered briefly. It was good. Jessica pursed her lips for a moment, as if trying to hold back her tears. If someone had told me then that it would all end like this. He wanted to answer that it was her fault, but he restrained himself. Instead, he asked, Where are the children? Mike went to see a friend, and Sarah is studying in her room. David nodded, sat down in the chair opposite, and ran his hand through his hair. I visited a lawyer. The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Jessica slowly closed the album, her fingers trembling. So you have decided. Finally? Yes, he looked up at her. I don't see any other way out. She looked away. Understand. The silence lasted for several minutes. David felt that he needed to go out to clear his head so as not to explode from emotions. But it was at that moment that Sarah appeared on the threshold. Her blue eyes looked from one parent to the other. "Are you fighting?" she asked carefully. "No," David hastened to answer. "We're just talking." Sarah frowned. "About what?" Jessica opened her mouth, but remained silent. David sighed. "About divorce, Sarah." The daughter looked down, crumpling the edge of her t-shirt. Her face turned pale. "So, it's still a divorce? Forever?" "Yes," David answered quietly. We can't do otherwise." Sarah nodded, as if summing up in her mind what she had long suspected, but her eyes filled with tears. "What about us? What's wrong with us?" David stood up, walked over to her, and carefully put his arm around her shoulders. "We still love you and Mike. We will always love. It's just that now we'll have to live differently." Sarah twitched a little, as if she didn't want a hug, but still didn't pull away. "And all because Mom," she didn't finish, glancing at Jessica. She sat with her head bowed, and her face was not visible because of her hair. "Sarah," David said softly, "we are adults, and this is our decision. Please don't blame yourself with Mike." "We don't blame you," she muttered, and there was a hidden reproach in her voice. "It's just a pity that you are destroying everything." With these words, she carefully freed herself from his arms and left the living room, giving her mother a parting look that showed disappointment and pain. David followed her with his eyes, feeling the heavy burden of responsibility for what the children were experiencing now. Even though he understood that the initiator of the divorce was the result of Jessica's act, in the eyes of Sarah and Mike everything looks different. The family is falling apart, and both parents are to blame. "I'll talk to her later," Jessica said quietly, noticing the way David looked after her daughter. "You can try, but I'm not sure that she will be ready for this." He turned around and went out into the yard, where the autumn wind stirred the still green leaves. Here, in the fresh air, it was a little easier to breathe. In the distance, the sound of skateboard wheels could be heard. One of the teenagers was skating down the street. Everything is as usual, life goes on, but their world is collapsing. While David was struggling with his emotions and preparing divorce papers, Jessica tried to reach Ashley. She texted her, tried to call her, sent her emails, but she ignored everything. Finally, after a few more days, Ashley answered, but very briefly, "I don't want to see you. Leave me alone." Jessica decided to meet her in person. She knew where Ashley's new apartment was, a small apartment complex near the center, second floor, overlooking the parking lot. On Saturday morning, when David and Mike left for some game in the city, and Sarah stayed at home to do her homework, Jessica got into the car and headed to her sister. The journey took half an hour. She parked near a gray building, glanced sideways at the peeling paint, and thought about the conditions in which Ashley now lives after leaving Alex. Climbing the creaky stairs, she stopped in front of a door with the peeling number 9B. She knocked. Silence. Jessica repeated the knock a little louder. "Ashley, it's me. Open it, please." Nothing happened for several seconds, but suddenly the door opened slightly. Ashley stood in the doorway wearing a baggy sweater, with dark circles under her eyes and a tired expression on her face. Seeing Jessica, she frowned. "I told you I don't want to see you." "I know," Jessica answered quietly, "but I need to talk to you. This is important." Ashley rolled her eyes, as if agonizing over whether she should slam the door in her sister's face or listen. Finally, she sighed heavily. "Okay, come in for 5 minutes, but no more." The inside of the apartment turned out to be modest. A couple of chairs, a small sofa, a table, stacked boxes in the corner. It looks like Ashley still hasn't unpacked her things. The smell of cheap coffee was in the air. "Have a seat," she suggested reluctantly, pointing to the sofa. She remained standing with her arms crossed over her chest. Jessica sat up, feeling her heart pounding in her chest. She understood that her sister was furious and had every right to be. "How are you?" she asked, trying to speak softly. Fine, Ashley answered dryly. It's already better than when I lived with that bastard. Jessica swallowed, trying to get rid of the lump in her throat. Ashley, I know I hurt you. And to David and the whole family, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I understand that this is unforgivable. But it is important for me that you hear at least part of the explanation. The sister looked at her with contempt. Explanations? What is there to explain? You slept with my husband. It's funny how people usually do these things out of hatred. But if you tried to destroy me, then congratulations, you succeeded. I didn't mean to destroy you, I swear, Jessica begged. It was stupidity, I don't know. Perhaps I was looking for some kind of emotional support when my relationship with David became cool. Alex was there, he complained about you, that you didn't get along, that you were cold to him. I don't know how it happened, we both made a mistake. A mistake? Ashley narrowed her eyes. Do you know what a mistake is? Forgetting to buy bread at the store. And sleeping with your sister's husband is not a mistake, but a betrayal. Jessica covered her face with her hands. Yes, betrayal. You're right. And I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I just want you to know that. I didn't have real feelings for him. It was an obsession, some kind of intoxication. What's in it for me? Ashley smiled bitterly. Your feelings did not save me from pain and humiliation. Now I'm alone in this miserable apartment, and my husband is probably spending time with other women. Or with whom else, I don't know. But I know that my own sister stuck a knife in my back. I understand, Jessica whispered. I'm guilty, and I'm ready to bear responsibility. Whatever you want to do, I will accept. No, you don't understand, Ashley answered harshly. Even if you lay down on your knees and asked for forgiveness, it wouldn't be enough for me. I don't want to deal with you anymore. Dot. They were silent for several agonizing seconds until Jessica asked, How are you doing with your divorce? Is Alex trying to win you back? Ashley blinks. Yes, I don't want to see him. He wrote to me and threatened that if I didn't stop calling him names in front of my friends, he would reveal some of my sins. I don't know what he means, but I don't care. Divorce and that's it. I understand, Jessica nodded. If you need any support money, help finding a lawyer. I don't need any money or help from you, Ashley interrupted her sharply. Enough, you've already done enough. Okay, Jessica said humbly. I won't force myself on you. Just know that I am ready to help if you suddenly need it. Ashley sighed heavily. You can leave. I have nothing more to tell you. You are no longer my sister. Jessica's heart sank. Tears came to her eyes, but she knew that crying here would mean causing even more hostility. So she just stood up, took her bag, and walked out the door without looking back. Already in the car, when that peeling entrance door closed behind her, she burst into tears, shaking with a feeling of guilt and loneliness. While all these battles with adult emotions and grievances were going on, children were also experiencing their own internal storm. Mike, who had a quicker temperament, sharply cut himself off from his mother when he learned the truth. Sarah was more sensitive and sometimes tried to calm conflicts, but she could not close her eyes to what happened. One day, Mike decided to talk to his father. It happened in the evening when David was looking through work reports in the living room. Mike entered without knocking, sat down on the sofa opposite, and stared at his father with a wary gaze. Dad, he said, barely squeezing out the words, I need your help. I want to understand how to live further. David put down the papers. Son, I understand that this is hard for you. Ask whatever you want. Mike ran his hand through his hair. I'm angry at my mother. Very angry, and I don't understand how to behave. I love her, she is my mother, but I cannot forgive her for what she did. This is low and stupid. How could she do this? David sighed heavily. I understand you. I experience similar feelings myself. But remember that, no matter what, she loves you and Sarah. She didn't mean to hurt you. But she hurt. Mike blurted out, slamming his fist on the couch. She hurt you, Aunt Ashley. Everyone. Because of her, we will no longer live together. I already heard that you will divorce her. Yes, David confirmed. But this does not change the fact that you are her children. She will remain your mother, and you will remain the most important thing in her life. It's just that now you have to learn to live in two houses." Mike looked down gloomily. "What if I don't want to live with her? Can I stay with you?" David felt his heart clench at the request. He understood that the boy was offended and that this was not just a whim, but a sincere desire to isolate himself from the pain. "We'll discuss this when the court considers custody," he answered carefully. "I don't want to force you. If you decide to live with me, I will be happy. But your mother may want you to live alternately. A week with me, a week with her, for example." "I don't know." Mike shook his head. "I hate her now. And I can't imagine that I will live in a house where she walks around, cooks, and pretends that everything is normal." David wanted to say that hate was too strong a word, but he understood that his son was now burning with feelings of teenage maximalism. Force him to be tolerant. This can only increase the conflict. "Mike, I understand your anger," he chose his words, "but try not to destroy yourself with this hatred. You will have to communicate with your mother, at least about school, documents, and questions about your future. Try to keep your distance, but don't become completely bitter." Mike looked at his father as if he wasn't sure whether to believe him. But then he nodded. "Okay, I'll try. But if she tries to come at me with her hugs and conversations, I won't be able to stand it." "I understand," David said. "And if you need to talk it out, always come to me. Don't keep everything to yourself." Mike pursed his lips as if holding back tears and nodded. For him, apparently, this was the limit of emotional frankness. Then he got up and, silently, left the living room. David watched him and felt bitterness. He knew that the teenager needed space, but at the same time he understood how much Milk needed parental love now. And the parents themselves are torn between pain, resentment, and the impending divorce. A few days later, David unexpectedly ran into Alex. This happened in the evening when David was returning from work on a commuter train. He was walking through the parking lot, holding a briefcase in his hands, and suddenly noticed a familiar silhouette next to the car next to him. Alex stood with his elbows on the black sedan and smoked. Seeing David, he slightly tilted his head, as if inviting him to conversation. At first, David wanted to just pass by, but something inside exploded. Some deep-seated sense of justice or desire to understand more closely. I didn't understand it myself. He stepped towards Alex, clenched his fists, but at the last second stopped himself from punching him. "What are you doing here?" he spat. Alex exhaled slowly. "I work in this area. I have a meeting with a client on business. I saw you and decided to wait." "For what?" David crossed his arms over his chest. Alex shrugged. "Maybe we can talk. I don't want us to be enemies forever." David smiled bitterly. "Enemies? Yes, I would gladly have nothing to do with you for the rest of my life." "I understand," Alex winced. "It's my fault. In front of you, in front of Ashley. But is it really that simple?" "It's simple for me," David answered coldly. "You slept with my wife. You ruined the marriage with my sister-in-law, yours, hers, and mine. Now I'm getting divorced. Ashley is getting divorced. What's so difficult about it?" Alex took a drag from his cigarette. "Look, I'm not trying to make excuses, but Ashley and I were on the edge for a long time. And Jessica, she was unhappy with you. We just found solace in each other." Blood rushed to David's face. "Consolation? Are you serious? This is the most disgusting thing that could be done. Not only did you betray Ashley, but you destroyed my family." Alex looked up. "Are you sure that your family was that strong? Maybe you never paid attention to her needs." David felt his mouth go dry. He knew that he sometimes stayed late at work and did not pay as much attention to Jessica as at the beginning of the marriage. But damn it, this doesn't justify what happened one bit. "Whatever happened between Jessica and me," he muttered, "does not give you the right to interfere with my family. You could leave Ashley and look for someone else. Just have 10 mistresses, I don't care. But not my wife." Alex threw away the cigarette butt. "I know. I won't lie to you that I had real feelings for her. There was attraction, passion, the euphoria of prohibition. This is all. I didn't want to hurt anyone, but it turned out the way it turned out." How did it happen? David repeated, and his voice sounded like steel. And now I have no other choice but to get a divorce and try to rebuild my life again. I hate you, Alex, and I hope I never see you again. He turned to leave, but Alex called out to him. Wait, David. I understand that we are now enemies, but I have one request from you. What other requests? David got angry. Don't turn Ashley against me any more than she already is. Alex looked straight into David's eyes. Yes, it's my fault, but I don't want to be deprived of the opportunity to ever see my child, if Ashley and I have one. David turned around sharply. What are you talking about? You don't have children. Alex looked away. Not yet. But Ashley recently said she was late and suspected she was pregnant. I don't know if it ended up being a false alarm or not. She doesn't make contact. David shook his head, shocked by the new revelation. Are you completely crazy? Alex shrugged. Maybe, but I don't want to completely ruin my life. Yes, I made a mistake. But the child is not to blame here, if there is one at all. David was seething inside. The news of Ashley's possible pregnancy shocked him. He didn't know if Alex was bluffing or telling the truth. But he could not resolve this issue. He turned around and walked away, throwing over his shoulder. These are your problems. Don't mess with me. The days passed, and the tension in the house did not subside. Jessica understood that the chances of saving the marriage were fading by the minute, but she did not want to give up without a fight. She decided that she needed to see a psychologist to understand her feelings and perhaps find a way to regain her husband's trust. Finding online contacts for a marriage counselor named Mary Hollies, she made an appointment and went there alone. Mary turned out to be a woman of about 45, with a soft voice and penetrating eyes. Sitting in the cozy office with the scent of lavender, Jessica felt like she could trust her. So, Jessica, Mary began as they sat down in their chairs, tell me what brought you to me. Jessica sighed and confusedly began to retell the events. Her betrayal, David's reaction, the decision to divorce, problems with the children, with Ashley. Mary listened, occasionally asking clarifying questions, and took notes. I see, she said when the story came to an end. You want to save the marriage, but your husband is determined to divorce. What are your motives? Do you really love your husband, or are you afraid of the social consequences of divorce? This question took Jessica by surprise. She wondered if all her prayers to save her family were just the fear of being left alone, without means, without the status of a happy wife. I think I still love him, she said timidly. I got confused, made a terrible mistake, but that doesn't cancel our years together. David is a good person. I didn't want to hurt him. Mary nodded. You say you didn't mean to cause pain. But nevertheless, they did it. What motivated you then? Jessica closed her eyes, trying to comprehend everything that was hidden behind her actions. Probably a feeling of loneliness and dissatisfaction. David was at work all the time. I sat at home, took care of everyday life, and felt like a nobody. And Alex. He paid compliments, was attentive, admitted that I inspire him. It was nice. That is, you were looking for confirmation of your importance, Mary summed up, and they found it with Alex. But now that everything has been revealed, you feel guilty. Okay, that's natural. But what do you want to do next? I don't want to lose my family, Jessica whispered. I'm ready to do anything to get David to forgive me. But he doesn't listen. It's very difficult to forgive something like this, Mary said softly. Sometimes people cannot get over betrayal, especially when it comes to such close relatives. In addition to adultery, your sister is also involved. Double betrayal. Tears welled up in Jessica's eyes again. Yes, I understand. I think I buried everything. But maybe there's a chance. There is always a chance if both partners want to fight for the marriage, Mary answered. But it looks like David doesn't want to. At least for now. It's possible that things will change over time, but you can't guarantee it. You will have to prepare for the fact that your marriage will end and learn to rebuild your life, including your relationship with your children. The psychologist's words hit her like a sledgehammer, but Jessica knew it was true. She sighed. Fine, I'll try to accept this. What should I do now? Work on yourself, Mary answered. Continue therapy if you see the point in it. Communicate with children, explain to them that you love them and do not want to cause more pain. And very important, do not try to force David back. Any pressure will only push him further away. Jessica nodded quietly. She had to admit that much was lost forever and try to at least maintain the remnants of respect and connection with the children. When the reception ended, she left Mary's office with a slightly different attitude, still filled with grief, but now more conscious. Another 2 weeks later, the first divorce hearing was scheduled. David has already agreed on all the documents with Carla, identifying betrayal as the reason. Jessica, in turn, hired another lawyer, a short, middle-aged woman named Megan Fury, who specialized specifically in family disputes with an emphasis on protecting the interests of the wife. The hearing took place in a small courtroom with only the judge, the clerk, and both parties and their attorneys present. David noticed that Jessica looked tired and depressed, although she tried to dress up in a discreet gray suit. He himself felt a lot of stress. His fingers trembled when he signed the last papers before entering the hall. The judge, a lean man of about 60 with a pale face, began, as expected, reading out the formalities. Then he gave the floor to Carla, who briefly outlined David's position: betrayal of his wife, serious moral damage, loss of trust, inability to continue family life. Then Megan took the floor, explaining that Jessica, although she admits guilt, considers it possible to save the marriage, and if divorce cannot be avoided, she demands joint custody of the children and a fair division of property. The judge listened carefully to both sides, then asked several clarifying questions. When the topic of custody came up, he raised an eyebrow. "Mr. David Lewis, do you insist on sole custody?" David cleared his throat. "I would prefer that the children live with me most of the time, but I don't want to deprive them of their mother. I just think that they themselves don't want to spend a lot of time with her now, especially the eldest son." The judge turned his gaze to Jessica. "Miss Lewis, what do you say?" She clasped her hands. "I love my children and don't want them to grow up without me. I believe we can establish a joint custody schedule." "I understand," the judge nodded, "especially since, as far as I know, there is no evidence of your incapacity or abuse. Cheating on your partner does not automatically make you a bad mother." David's heart sank. Of course, he understood this himself, but he wanted someone to support his pain and indignation. However, law and morality are different things. The judge cares, above all, about the well-being of the children. As for the division of property, the judge continued, flipping through the papers. "You have a house, an almost paid mortgage, joint accounts. Are you going to sell the house, or will one of you buy the other's share?" Carla replied that David was willing to consider a buyout if he had the means to do so. Megan hinted that Jessica could also lay claim to the house, given her contributions and years of living together. The judge deferred further discussion to subsequent hearings because the issue required an appraisal of the property. After the hearing, the parties went out into the corridor. David walked further, trying not to cross paths with Jessica, but she caught up with him, touching him by the sleeve of his jacket. "David," she said quietly, "can you listen to me for a minute?" He stopped, looking at her with a cold gaze. "What else?" "I know things are bad with us," she said, without removing her hands. "But let's try to find a compromise, at least because of the children." David felt a pang of conscience. Children really suffer. "Okay," he agreed reluctantly, "but that doesn't mean I'll forgive everything. We can try to avoid a fight in court, but I will not budge on the divorce." She nodded, barely hiding her tears. "Understand. Thank you for this, at least." He felt tired and looked down at the floor. It seemed to him that he was dragging a mountain on himself, with no end in sight. The legal process had just begun, but there was almost no strength left. During this difficult time, David was supported by friends, including former classmate Steve. He worked as a lawyer in a related field, sometimes encountered family law, but specialized more in corporate matters. He called David and suggested they meet at a bar after work. The bar turned out to be quiet, dimly lit, and with a saxophonist playing on stage. Steve, a tall man with a neat beard, ordered whiskey for himself and offered David a beer. "Well, friend," he said when they sat down at a table in the corner, "how are you holding up?" "It's difficult," David admitted. "It seems like everything is going according to plan. I filed for divorce, prepared the documents, but inside everything hurts." Steve nodded understandingly. "Understand. Such things never pass without a trace. But you must move on with your life. You have children, a career. What about psychological help?" "I don't like these things," David sighed. "Yes, and therapy requires time, money. Although, maybe this is not superfluous." "It won't be superfluous," Steve confirmed. "I went when I was divorcing my first wife. This helped me stay awake." David looked at his friend in surprise. "I never knew you were getting divorced." Steve grinned. "Yes, it was a long time ago, long before my current wife. There was a dirty story there too. But I understood one thing. I need to take care of myself and not keep the pain inside." David looked at his friend gratefully. "Maybe it's really worth looking for a specialist who can help you talk it out." Deep down, he felt like he was losing it, especially when he thought about Jessica cheating on him. "I'll try," he said quietly. "Thank you." They sat for a while longer, discussing work matters and the football match, trying to move away from heavy topics. But at the end of the evening, when they were paying, Steve said, "And one more thing, David. It is possible that in a year or two everything will calm down, and you will look at it differently. Maybe you'll even forgive me." David shook his head. "Don't think. I can't imagine how anyone can forgive what she did. Nobody knows what will happen in a few years. But even if you don't forgive, look forward. There are many other women who would be glad to have a man like you." Steve winked, trying to cheer him up. David grinned, but in his heart he only half agreed. Now he didn't even want to think about new relationships when his heart ached from the old ones. The divorce proceedings continued as usual. Lawyers on both sides carried documents, appointed independent appraisers for the value of the house. The children tried to stay away. Mike avoided talking altogether, and Sarah occasionally asked something about the trial, but quickly switched gears. A month after the first hearing, an incident occurred that further ruined the situation. Jessica apparently wanted to be closer to the children and decided to pick Sarah up after the music club without notifying David. He was just planning to pick up his daughter himself. When he arrived at the school, it turned out that Sarah had already been taken by her mother. David, angry at the inconsistency, rushed home. In the yard, he saw Sarah getting out of Jessica's car and then heading towards the house, carrying a heavy violin case in her hands. David parked his car and jumped out. "Jessica, what the... couldn't you have warned me that you were going to take Sarah?" She frowned. "Should I report? I am also her parent." Sarah looked at her father in fear, then at her mother. "Dad, it's okay. Mom decided to make a surprise." "Surprise?" David raised his voice. "You can't imagine how worried I was. I thought something had happened." "Sorry," Jessica replied coldly, "but I wanted to spend time with my daughter." "So do it normally," David snapped. "Call me, warn me." He noticed how Sarah was clutching the case more and more tightly to herself, nervous because of their screams. Mike heard the noise and looked out the second-floor window, rolling his eyes. It seemed that the quarrel was about to develop into another scandal. Jessica sighed heavily. "David, I didn't want a conflict. We just rarely see Sarah now. I thought if I picked her up, we'd have time to talk in the car." "Okay," David tried to calm down. "But damn it, I don't like it when you make decisions like that unilaterally." "I have the right to do that," she retorted. "Until the end of the trial, we both have the same rights to children." Sarah, without waiting for continuation, quickly walked into the house and disappeared into the corridor. David softened. "Jessica, I don't want to turn every conversation we have into a scandal, but please agree with me on such things. It's hard enough for children." Jessica nodded, although with a dissatisfied expression on her face. "Okay, I will warn you in future." The dispute ended there, but the bitterness remained. David realized that after a divorce, situations like this could arise all the time: holidays, school events, vacation trips, and every time you have to negotiate with the person who betrayed you in the most cruel way. This thought alone drove him into despair. The day of the second court hearing was approaching, at which issues of guardianship and property division were to be discussed more substantively. David felt exhausted. Incessant arguments with Jessica, the dissatisfaction of the children, his own pain, all this interfered with work and sleep. He had lost a few pounds, and colleagues at the office noticed that he looked tired and irritable. On the day of the hearing, he met with Carla again before entering the courtroom. Carla looked collected, was holding a folder with papers in her hands, and was constantly checking some of her notes. "Today, we will try to consolidate the custody schedule," she said. "If the judge considers it possible to issue a temporary order before the divorce is final, he may do so." David nodded. "I just want the kids to be with me most of the time." "I understand," Carla looked at him sternly, "but be prepared that the judge will still want an equal distribution if Jessica insists." In the courtroom, Jessica was already sitting with her lawyer Megan. She looked anxious, stealing glances at David. He tried not to look at her. The judge came out, everyone stood up, then sat down. The trial began. The topic of guardianship was the first to be raised. The judge asked whether the parties had discussed a compromise. Carla said David was willing to compromise, but wanted the children to express their own preferences. Megan, on the contrary, said that children should not decide the fate of their parents and that Jessica has equal rights. "Mr. Lewis," the judge turned to David, "you said that your son would like to live with you. What about your daughter?" "Sarah hasn't decided yet," David answered. "She's only 14, she's confused." "I understand." The judge turned to the lawyers. "Maybe we can appoint a special representative for the children to find out their opinion without pressure from the parents." Megan nodded approvingly. Carla didn't object. The judge made a note. "Fine. Then, temporarily, I establish joint custody, where the children live 1 week with their father, 1 week with their mother, until we come to a final decision." David felt disappointed, but I understood that in the current realities, this is the most typical option. Megan looked satisfied, and Jessica sighed heavily, as if she was hoping for something more. Then they started talking about the division of property. The house was appraised at a decent amount, and Carla suggested that David buy out her share from Jessica, given that he was paying off most of the mortgage. Megan objected that Jessica made a contribution in the form of housekeeping and raising children, and therefore has the right to half. The judge listened to both sides and said he would make a decision later, but most likely it would be a conditional award in favor of Jessica if the house was left to David. The hearing ended, and the judge announced a break until the next time, giving the parties time to prepare additional documents. As he left the room, David felt that his hopes that Jessica would give up some of her rights had been dashed. She fought to maintain ties with her children and receive decent compensation. But the most important thing that David was thinking about at that moment, the judge officially approved their schedule of life. 1 week he has the kids, the next week Jessica has them. The marriage actually collapsed, and the life of the family was reduced to a checklist of when, who, and where would spend the night. Despite the fact that there was an official divorce, Jessica apparently did not give up hope of somehow getting David back. One evening, when she was having her week with the children, she asked David to come over for a family dinner. Like, Sarah is bored, and Mike needs to discuss his choice of college. David initially wanted to refuse, but thought that maybe having dinner together would actually be good for the children. Arrived at the usual time. The kitchen smelled of something delicious. Sarah was setting the table, and Mike was sitting at the phone. "Hi," Jessica said, glancing at him. "I cooked pasta. I hope you don't mind." "Fine," David answered coldly. He felt a slight déjà vu. Everything was the same as in the old days, only the atmosphere was saturated with alienation. The children behaved tensely. Mike hardly spoke. Sarah tried to ask questions about school, but the conversation didn't go well. Jessica tried to be a hospitable hostess. She smiled and offered refills. David answered in monosyllables, trying not to look at her again. When dinner was almost over, Sarah went to the second floor, citing homework, and Mike went out into the garden, still talking on the phone. David stood up to leave. "Wait," Jessica asked, coming closer to him than usual. "Let's talk." "No children." "About what?" he asked, still standing, not wanting to sit down. "I want to apologize again and say that." She bit her lip. "To say that if you suddenly decide that we can try to return everything, I'm ready." David looked at her incredulously. "Are you serious?" She smiled faintly. "Yes, I know that we are divorced, but there are times when people separate and then get back together. We have a lot in common, David, and I swear that I will never look at another man again. Just give me a chance." It was as if a needle had pierced David's heart. He remembered all their happy moments, but immediately photos from the hotel and conversations about her affair appeared before his eyes. "No, Jessica," he said firmly, "I won't be able to forget this. Every time I touch you, the image of you and Alex will pop up in my head." She cried, "But we have children. 17 years of marriage. Doesn't all this mean anything to you?" But it's already in the past. You crossed that out the day you decided to go to bed with Alex." Tears flowed down her cheeks. She tried to take his hand, but he pulled away. "Sorry, Jessica," he said quietly. "I can't live in constant suspicion. And I don't love you like I used to." Her face contorted in pain. She realized that this was the end. David looked at his watch and added, "I'll go. Tomorrow I will pick up the children at school, according to the court decision." He went to the door, and she remained standing in the kitchen, clutching a napkin in her hands. This was the moment of the final break. Neither he nor she had any doubts that the marriage had died, and with it all hopes for a miraculous salvation. Several more difficult months of court proceedings, negotiations between lawyers, and discussions of property and custody terms passed. In the end, the parties reached an agreement. The house went to David, but he paid Jessica a large sum of compensation. Custody remained shared, with a flexible schedule where the children could choose where they wanted to spend more time. The day of the final hearing arrived. Only the most necessary people gathered in the small courtroom: David and Carla, Jessica and Megan. The children, fortunately, were not present. The judge read the divorce decree, declaring that the marriage was officially dissolved. "Congratulations," Carla said quietly to David as they left. "I mean, congratulations on finally ending this process. And then life." "Thank you," he replied, feeling bitterly relieved. "Yes, it's finally over." He looked at Jessica, who was standing off to the side, talking to Megan. He felt that there was an abyss between them. No love, no tenderness, no warmth, only memories and pain. For a moment their gazes crossed. In her eyes, he read something like, "I still love you, but I can't change anything." David looked away. Now he has his own life, and she has hers. "Well," he exhaled, moving towards the exit, "it's time to go." Thus ended one of the most important chapters of his life. And although his heart was heavy, he felt a drop of relief. He made a decision, went through all the torment, did not forgive, and did not pretend that he could return to the past. Perhaps someday he will regret it. But not today. Today he just wanted to get some sleep and start learning to live again. Several weeks have passed since the official divorce. Life was gradually getting better. David woke up alone in the big house on Oak Street, sometimes hearing the children laugh when his week came. Mike stayed with his father more often, and Sarah sometimes preferred time with her mother, sometimes with her father, but overall sought balance. David set up one of the rooms as his personal office, where he placed an exercise machine and a work desk. He began seeing a psychologist that Steve had recommended and gradually released the pent-up bitterness and resentment. It was not a quick process, but he felt that the path to healing had been found. Jessica settled nearby in an apartment that her parents helped her rent. Ashley still hadn't spoken to her, but rumor had it that Ashley had gotten her life back on track. Alex finally lost ties with his family. His marriage collapsed, and his relationship with Jessica also became a thing of the past. She was probably left with nothing but disappointment in herself and pain in her relationship with her sister. One evening, while David was sitting in the backyard looking at the stars, Mike came out to him. He sat down next to him and, looking down, said, "Dad, I'm sorry I've been rude lately. I was angry, but it was a nightmare for you too." David smiled, sincerely for the first time in a long time. "It's okay, son. I understand you." They were silent for a moment, listening to the crickets chirping in the night sky. Then Mike asked, "Aren't you angry with Mom anymore?" David thought, "The anger has passed. All that was left was fatigue, and probably some kind of regret. But you can't live in the past." Mike nodded, turning away to hide his tears. He already understood that his family would never be the same, but maybe after some time he would be able to find harmony in the new arrangement of life. David put his arm around his son's shoulders, and they sat like that, looking at the endless starry sky, silently exchanging the support that they both needed. A quiet hope suddenly stirred inside David. Yes, he did not forgive the betrayal, and the marriage ended, but life goes on, and in this life he has children, there is a future, and there is a chance to learn to be happy again. He didn't know what awaited him around the corner, but he was sure of one thing: the worst was over. He made his choice, going through betrayal and pain, and now, on this warm summer night, he felt that he could start all over again. Maybe not with Jessica, but with himself, with his principles, and with the belief that a sincere relationship still exists somewhere ahead. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.